welcome to LawWiser. Environmental social governance is a concept that is gaining prominence across the globe. Companies are actually focusing on making sustainable choices. They're working towards minimizing their operations' impacts on the biodiversity. We're also hearing about the ESG funds. A lot of asset management companies seems to be interested in investing in this. To understand environmental social governance, we have experts with us. We have Mr. Mahesh Pratap Singh. He's the head of sustainability at Flipkart. We have Shujath Bin Ali. He's the general counsel of Ramky Enviro Engineers. And Mr. Nawneet Vibhaw. He's the partner at Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas. So to begin with, I would like to ask Nawneet, what is ESG, Environmental Social Governance concept, and what are the regulations in India that actually govern it?
So thank you for the question, Sania, and hello to everyone. So if we talk about ESG, I think in simple words, as we all understand, ESG refers to environment, social, and the governance issues which investors use to evaluate themselves and also to set standards which the companies need to abide by to obtain funding. And I think the reason as to why in recent times this has actually gained a lot of prominence is because I think there is a real need for everyone to evaluate the businesses on parameters which are related to environment, social, and governance aspects. And I think somewhere this has also happened due to the changing societal mindset where various stakeholders, including your consumers, activists, investors, all of them, they demand more transparency in businesses. So I think what has also prompted this whole focus on ESG in recent times is this increased regulatory and litigation risk, because there is a greater need these days to scrutinize, corporate behavior. And having said that, I think, to say that this is something which is completely new may not be correct, because these concepts, with respect to environment, labor issues, corruption issues, and generally, more transparency and all of that, I think they've always been there, and we've always had laws across jurisdictions to actually govern these aspects. But just that, I think now there's more concerted effort, there is a more organized effort. The regulators have realized the importance of this. The companies, and most importantly, in fact, the investors have realized that, you need to actually take into consideration these non-financial factors also, and because they are equally important, if not more than the financial factors. So anyone who would actually, invest into a certain business has to actually look at the ESG performance to see how sustainable the business is. So I think lenders are increasingly incorporating ESG metrics in evaluation of borrowers and also in credit analysis and all of that. So that's pretty much, I think, what ESG is all about. If I have to tell you in terms of what the laws with respect to environment, social, and governance aspects are there in India, I think environmental laws have, of course, always been there with respect to the laws with respect to pollution control, air pollution, water pollution, overall environment protection. Of course, I think the laws with respect to waste management have become very prominent, and especially with respect to the kind of waste which clearly have a very, very detrimental effect on the environment. The second aspect, of course, the S of the ESG is where you talk about the social aspects, the labor laws and all of that. And I think that's where, you talk about the employment conditions, wages, social security. In India, of course, you have these codes which have come in last year, which focus on all of these. They've basically brought in all the labor laws together, and they have made it into these 3-4 codes, and which deal with all these aspects, including occupational health, safety, and working conditions and all of that. And of course, the G of it is governance, for which you always have laws with respect to transparency, disclosures, white collar crimes, money laundering, and all that kind of stuff. Data privacy, of course, has been a topic which has been has gained a lot of prominence in the last couple of years, I would say, ever since this whole draft bill was being discussed. And most likely, we are expecting that in the next session of the Parliament, this might just become a law. So I think that's pretty much the overall legal framework when it comes to governing ESG in India. And I think in terms of, so not really laws, but I think one of the other things which the companies have to keep in mind is, what has been prescribed by the regulators. And that basically says that earlier you had the business responsibility reports. Now you have something called the business responsibility report. So you have the BRSR format for the top 1,000 companies, and then for the others you have the BRSR light format. And of course, it's not mandatory right now. It becomes mandatory only to 2021 onwards, but it will remain to be seen as to how much, especially the companies for which it is it's completely voluntary. I think we'll have to see as to how they actually decide to comply with it and how they really want to honor it. For people who actually invest in mutual funds, or generally, you would have seen that in recent times you've had a lot of these ESG funds coming in, and I don't want to name those funds because personally, I of course follow the markets and stuff. I don't invest because I'm very conservative in terms of these things. But I think that's kind of a very positive development, and it also shows that there's a lot of importance with respect to ESG aspects. So if say banks or these they are actually creating funds which are totally focusing on companies which have given a lot of importance to ESG aspects, I think that's a very, very positive development, and that also shows the mindset as to as to how the investors think. So I think tapping that I think is a very positive development for India, and I think I already know of at least 5 or 6 funds which are totally ESG based, and I think that is only going to grow in the recent times. So I think that's a very positive development.
Thank you, Nawneet. Thank you for sharing, and making us understand this whole concept of ESG. Mahesh, as you lead the sustainability at Flipkart, how do you think the company actually focuses on integrating ESG, and how do you think ESG will actually shape the future of businesses, and especially with the perspective of your e-commerce companies?
Thanks for the question. Hi, everyone. Pleased to be here. So I think Nawneet did touch upon a lot of those significance and pressures coming from regulatory standpoint, but I think there's an equally important or even bigger drive which comes from businesses within, because when you look at today the landscape we are operating in, we operate in a fairly interconnected world. Supply chains are global, right? And you have power of internet in hand of consumers, where you don't have to wait for a week or a fortnight or a quarter to discover anything. It all makes a great sort of melting pot of why businesses need to really drive a lot of these out of conscience, out of their own actions, as opposed to waiting for regulators to start determining that. From our vantage point, where we operate in Flipkart, a lot of that ESG related action comes from our drive to really own and move that agenda and charter forward. And that really goes on each of those 3 pillars, be it how we treat our responsibility to planet, be it how we renew our societal license to operate by taking communities along, or really doing the business in most ethical and right manner. The way we do this, which is equally important for any business operating in Indian context, is taking the whole value chain together, right? When you look at, let's say, take a simple example for e-commerce industry where I come from. We take pride in driving consumption in the country, which means we take sellers from the nooks and corners of the country and get them to deliver products across hinterland of the country or in the metros. But how do we then take that responsibility forward beyond just the business and economical considerations of doing it, to make sure that consumption is responsible, which means every time a package is moving from point A to point B, it is generating lesser carbon footprint. It is making sure that you're not creating packaging waste. You're uplifting artisans, weavers, handlooms, handicrafts, MSMEs, in driving the country's economy forward. And how do you do all of that by making sure that you have highest standard of governance, licenses, permit, ethical way of doing business? I can take multiple examples in how we approach it, but that's really the crux of it. The other responsibility for business, and this is very, very important in an emerging market kind of construct, especially in India, when we look at a lot of ESG parameters, we don't really have plug and play solutions. It's not that you're operating in a market where a lot of these problems are solved for, because a lot of solution needed here are needing to go through the filters of affordability, scalability, national reach, and so on. And businesses, especially Flipkart, takes immense sense of pride in rolling our sleeves and getting involved in identifying those solutions. When we launched our commitment to EV100, saying we would put 100% of our last mile on electric vehicle in 10 years, we did not necessarily wait or rely on a commercial vehicle ecosystem to be ready. But when we did that, given the kind of scale and the reach we enjoy in this market, we're now able to shape OEM manufacturers coming together, vehicle aggregators coming together and saying, look, okay, how do we solve for it? How do we solve for charging infrastructure? How do we solve for cost of running these vehicles? How do we make these vehicles more reliable? Similarly, when you look at, let's say, plastic waste, right? We came together and said, look, while there is no alternative available which meets all the criteria of moving away from plastic, are we going to wait for that alternative to come in and, or are we going to basically own this up and saying, we will determine this? We rolled our sleeves. Today we have filed for 2 patents when it comes to material design and innovation, right? If you would have asked me that question 15 months back when we started on the journey, I would have said, look, this is not our core objectives. So I think when we really look at ESG, the role businesses are going to play, it's going to be increasingly important because the pressure is going to come from every single aspect of regulators, consumers, your global supply chains, your financiers, investors, Nawneet alluded to. But at the same point in time, it's equally important for us to remain relevant because you're tapping into future resources. If consumption is not going to be responsible, in e-commerce context as an example, we're not going to be taking immense sense of pride 10 years out saying we drive consumption leveraging technology and supply chain in this country. So that, in a way, how we approach it and why we feel businesses are going to continue to lead charge on this particular issue in years and decades to come.
Thank you, Mahesh. This actually helps us understand how companies today are becoming aware of the concept and integrating it into their business, which makes us understand that this is also an interesting or an attractive option for the investors. So Shujath, if you can actually explain to us, what do you think are the expectations of the investors and what parameters do they consider while investing when it comes to ESG focused companies?
Yeah. So I would like to talk about 3 terms. One is the ESG investing, second is socially responsible investing, and third is the impact investing. Although all these 3 appear similar, there is a distinct difference between these 3. So ESG investment focuses more of evaluating the financial measures and integrating the ESG parameters with the overall investment strategy. With respect to the socially responsible investing, the focus is more with respect to investing in a responsible manner in norms of the ethical and societal guidelines. Largely, for example, there are some companies which focus on tobacco, gambling, casinos, and all of that. So, socially responsible investing avoids to invest in any of these sectors. And the third is the impact investing, wherein the focus of the investor is to promote a particular sector and try to invest which creates a benefit to the society. So these are the 3 parameters, different approaches with respect to the subject which you're talking about. I completely agree with my colleagues Nawneet and Mahesh with respect to the evolution of this whole topic. So these are all not new terms or new topics as such. These were already there. It's just that with the increasing societal awareness, with the new generations coming up, with the focus of company, focus of regulators, I think this has gained prominence. And I would say, if you see 5 to 10 years back, the focus was more on corporate governance. That's what everyone was talking about. But now the shift has been made towards the environmental, social, and governance as well. And from an investor standpoint, I think the mindset of the investors also have changed. So while they want to earn return, at the same time they want to put their money in an environment wherein they actually feel good about it, and it actually creates a positive environment to the society. With respect to the few parameters under the environmental, social, and governance, I would like to dwell a little detail. So when it comes to the environmental parameters, we all know the focus on clean energy, which is there, the pollution which is getting created, the climate change impact, use of natural resources as Mahesh talked about, Waste management, again, is a very significant aspect. How companies are actually generating waste and treating the waste, that's a critical impact. What has been their policy with respect to the animal welfare? So all of these elements, form part of the environmental parameters. With respect to the social parameters, of course, there are human rights, child and forced labor, involvement in community. I mean, you can talk about CSR, health and safety, stakeholder relationships, how we are dealing with these small scale industries with respect to the credit policies, employee relations, so on and so forth. And with respect to the governance, of course, all those elements of corporate governance, whether it is with respect to the board diversity or executive compensation, shareholder rights, minorities, interests, disclosures, all of these are all pretty important parameters with respect to the ESG investment. Now, if we talk about the data available, or how exactly can investor can make those choices. I mean, now you did mention about business responsibility reporting. There are some companies who are actually developing sustainability reporting and so on and so forth. And I think that will really be helpful for the investor to make a right choice. I also heard mentioning about some of the ESG funds or mutual funds as well. So I think that is also increasing, with respect to the focus as to what investing choices are. I mean, for example, I can tell you, I mean, I do invest. So I try to focus on socially responsible investment, largely because of some of my personal values. For example, I don't invest in a company which produces alcohol or tobacco and so on and so forth. Similarly, I think there are folks who focus on the ESG investing. One of the key challenges with respect to the investors is how do I get to make right decisions? Where is the information coming from? So largely that is the annual reports of the company, that is the websites of the company, the policies of the company, code of conducts of the company. So if you see the code of conduct and the values and the vision of the company, I think that would be a greater insight to evaluate what are the company's policies towards creditors, towards environment, towards people, towards health and safety, along with the annual reports. I think that would really give a larger insights. Apart from that, I think there are some agencies these days which are trying to come up with ESG ratings and rankings, but I think still a long way.
Thank you, Shujath, for highlighting the expectations and the various parameters that are usually considered by the investors. So, for any company to actually pursue this, what do you all think are the challenges that would be faced by them, or the issues, that arise while actually complying or focusing on ESG related activities?
Challenges, I would say, is more to do with the level of awareness and education. And I think why I say this is because, I think, the bigger companies clearly understand what ESG is all about and what is it that they need to do. And they have always been doing that, I think, because like my colleagues, they have actually been involved in organizations which of course are, which have a presence across countries, and, they are kind of into it for quite some time now. But I think the challenge really arises where you have these smaller companies and, so I think or even some of the other companies, they've not really warmed up to this idea of, something like an ESG, because they still see it as a compliance requirement, and the moment you put something in the bracket of a compliance requirement, then the level of attention and I think the quality of attention also kind of varies, and that's where the problem is. So I think that mindset has to change. People need to be educated, and especially the employees need to be educated and made to understand what this is all about and why this is not just a compliance requirement. This is much more than that, and this will decide how the company performs in the long run, how it is perceived in the long run. So that's there. Apart from that, I think the quality of the data, because I think what I understand is because ESG cuts across a lot of departments in an organization also. So I think, and I'm sure my colleagues will agree, collating this kind of data itself is a huge challenge even within the organization. So I think that has to be a little more streamlined, and that will happen over a period of time. What I also see as a challenge clearly is the accountability and the accuracy of the data. So I think many a times you don't really have ways of figuring out as to what is actually being said is actually correct. So I think that the quality of the data and the accuracy of the data is, again, I think very important. And I think my sense is that voluntary disclosure may not happen in a country like India. And the way I see this is because we are a country which, unless we are actually pushed to do things, we don't really do. So I think if you see, so SEBI also, they've made it mandatory for the top 1,000. For the remaining ones, it's still voluntary, and future maybe they'll also require them. Of course, they've given them the option in terms of format, what BR, SR Lite and all of that. But how many of them will actually start doing this or warm up to this idea? That is to be seen. So I think that's pretty much my thoughts on this. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Anya. Let me build on what Nawneet just articulated, and I think I'll pick on the point he made because that's pretty relevant. I know Nawneet talked about data, but when you look at just building on that, I think at the heart of it, ESG is a pretty subjective framework, right? And when you're looking at ESG and compare this, let's say, with financial reporting, you could go today, any single company between IFRS, Indian GAAP, you're going to have a fairly accurate sense of each line item, each metric, and everyone across the table have a fairly consistent understanding of what that line item is trying to articulate, right? The moment you come to something like ESG, given how subjective it is, the measurement framework, the reporting framework, what gets done, definitions, a lot of this is still evolving, and that leaves a lot of room for owners for either corporates to sort of adopt and define their own ways and means, and then bring a scientific or somewhat quantitative or objective measurement to it. I'll talk about our personal example from Flipkart. When we started on this journey, one of the first things we did was saying, look, we're going to look at every single asset in our platform portfolio, just talking about E as an example of ESG. And we're going to come back with a baselining of greenhouse gas footprint so that you have a number. And then when you measure that number year after year, because you moved packaging, because you moved renewable energy versus fossil fuel, because you moved fossil fuel driven vehicles to EV, how does that number move? But the definition, and I understand that it's not going to be one size fit all. It may have to be contextualized for each industry, but having a little bit more resemblance of standardization or a little bit more objectivity in that measurement framework will be useful for everyone across the table. Who drives that? Part of it is probably going to come from regulation, part of it is going to come from consultation across stakeholders and so on. But I think we're quite early in the journey, and that's one big opportunity to drive some resemblance of standardization across the table. The second issue is when you really look at today where we are, a lot of focus, spotlight, scrutiny has come in on large corporates and their ESG reportings, and you can cut it in many ways. You could cut it in terms of listed companies versus unlisted and so on. I think the system will be served pretty efficiently if the same investor scrutiny or sort of spotlight flows in building capacity at grassroots level. It's fine to have a pretty defined, let's say, plastic management framework for people to report to and adhere to. But as an economy, as an ecosystem, as a country, as a sort of global citizen group, if we don't really invest in building plastic alternative materials, it's just going to be a little bit of half-baked progress, right? So I think the other opportunity really out there is, as we move the corporate world to a pretty sort of objective sort of ESG index, how do we also make sure that there's enough going in terms of building capacity, where there will be solutions which will come in helping these corporates drive that ESG agenda and not trying to solve for it. In a perfect world, an e-commerce company shouldn't be filing patent for, let's say, hypothetically, alternative materials and so on. So we shouldn't be really getting an ecosystem together to drive electric vehicles on the roads. I think there's a little bit more room needed to be able to put resources to build capacity so that the ESG measurement is more robust across the whole end of value chain. I think those are the two key points for me.
Thanks, Mahesh and Nawneet. I think you added a lot of points. With respect to my thoughts with respect to the challenges, I think the first is the adoption. Again, when we're talking about the ESG things, large companies which we're talking about, we still need to see a similar dialogue in the middle sector companies and small companies as well. So that way, the adoption is still a long way to go. Second, is with respect to the policies. I mean, how much are we really hearing from the government with respect to the ESG policies? Although there are siloed efforts, it would be really good that if we have standardized policies from government with respect to the ESG. And I completely agree with Nawneet that I think voluntary disclosures will definitely have a challenge. So from that standpoint, would a Ministry of Corporate Affairs should have a ESG filing or ESG reporting for across all companies or based on some parameters? Again, this has to be balanced along with the ease of doing business as well. So from a policy standpoint, I think government can play a very key role with respect to the ESG. Similarly, I think focus on more analysis, standardization, as we talked about. Mahesh did talked about the qualitative and quantitative in the whole ESG reporting. While we may have quantitative reporting, there is a lot of subjective element, qualitative element. How do we standardize that? I think that is a very important element. So a concerted effort of the government and the corporates, investing segments, analysts, media as well. I think all of these things are really required, with respect to the ESG adoption and focus more on the ESG investing. A lot of perception that having ESG approach will mitigate the risk management. So that is one point which is there. I mean, if a company focuses on these three elements, then naturally the risk mitigation can definitely happen. That is one. And secondly, I think it's a cultural thing. I mean, as Nawneet rightly pointed out, if you think it as a compliance, it will not happen. But if you think it as a way of doing business, and this is the culture and the company's vision, mission, values has to be integrated. I'm seeing some of the companies, if you go and check the values and vision, mission, there are a few companies who will definitely have these elements in it. Yeah.
Thank you, Nawneet, Mahesh, and Shujath, for actually highlighting these issues. We are aware that voluntary disclosure might not be, very easily done in India. And at the same time, the ESG standards that has to be applied, it cannot be similar for across the industries. It has to be industry-wise. And at the same time, all of this has to be done in a way that focuses on ease of doing business as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for taking time out for us. This was very helpful for us. Thank you.